The following is a Hoop Ball presentation. Welcome to the Fantasy NBA Today podcast.
I don't rightly know if it's a good thing or a bad thing that NBA news has, kind of slowed down a little bit, at least for 2 or 3 days. We did have the Melo Schroeder deal going on late last week, which my good buddies Neil and Adrian covered on Friday's episode of this podcast. And then early this morning, we found out that it sounds like Carmelo Anthony is headed to Houston. We've seen that writing kind of on the wall for a couple of days. Although as a Laker fan over here, I was concerned that something might change. But after the Michael Beasley stuff, I think it was pretty clear that Melo was going to the Rockets. And that's really all we sit on right now. This is Fantasy NBA Today. I am Dan Besbris. Welcome to the program. This is a hoop ball presentation. I haven't bothered you guys for a ton of stuff lately, but let me just take about 30 or 40 seconds here early in the podcast to say, if you have a moment, please do rate and review the show. We appreciate it with all of our hearts. It is part of what allows us to continue to grow. I believe that in doing some research, subscriptions and actual number of plays is also pretty important. But as everybody gets back into the NBA swing and listenership slowly starts to climb up from its absolute low point, which does tend to happen in June. If there are new listeners of you, I should say, on the pod here, have a moment, just head on over to iTunes or the podcast app on your mobile device and drop us a nice positive review. Again, should you have a moment. Shouldn't take too long. It's pretty easy. As we get closer to the season, I'm going to be repeating this a lot more. But for now, we'll just stick one in here at the beginning of the show. Let's talk a little bit about what's coming up. We always like to set the table. It's the beginning of the week. It's the Monday show. We're going to move some bodies around on this week's podcast. I think you'll have me probably solo today, and then towards the end of the week as well. I think you'll have the Dan shows on Monday and Friday. And then you'll have a mixture of myself, Adrian, and Neil over the middle 3 days of this week. And what I'd like to do with our time here between now and early to mid-September, which, as I mentioned last week, is really when you start to dig hard into the draft stuff. That's when you start to get some legitimate ADP numbers out there, and you can break down the mock drafts, as I talked about with Adrian on last week's show. Between now and then, I'd like to spend our time on the two-person podcasts going through kind of the fundamental stuff. I was talking about setting a base, the foundational aspects of fantasy basketball. And we've done, I think, an okay job of that over the first week of trying. We got into mock draft strategy last week. We got into ranking strategy. I know Adrian and Neil got back into season prep, things like that. There's so many aspects that are worth covering. And not necessarily just the off-season stuff. Obviously, mock drafts, draft prep, that's the stuff that is going to overwhelm here between now and opening day. But even once you get into the season, there's a lot of things that it's good to know beforehand. And before you're in the thick of it. If it's early November and we're coming on the podcast and we're just telling you at that moment, hey, this is a time when things are a bit in flux, that's not that helpful. It's better to prepare for it. So, for instance, we could do a show in the next week or two, or tomorrow, I don't know. I don't have it graphed out that perfectly, about early November. And you're saying, well, it's late July, Dan. Isn't that a bit of a head start? Yeah, it's a bit of a head start, but it's also a really important time of the season. So we're going to take time here over the next few weeks, as I mentioned, to go through those foundational products. And simultaneously, as the bodies here have settled into their positions on different teams, the dust has come back to the earth. It's time now to do some rehash and check out what teams look like after free agency and after contract unloadings and after, well, I guess there have been a couple of trades, small ones, just Kawhi Leonard and so forth. And so that'll be the next few weeks on the podcast. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'm not going to give you a ton of warning as to what's coming on any individual day beforehand, but when we get into the shows, we'll obviously tell you what's coming up on that pod. This is our Monday show. I am Dan, at Dan Besbris on Twitter. You can follow at Hoopball Fantasy as well. Today's show is really going to be more of it's almost like preventative medicine on today's podcast. We're going to talk a bit about Carmelo Anthony, of course. I'd like to also weigh in briefly on the Schroeder-Melo half of that deal, which I didn't get to mention because I wasn't on the Friday podcast. So we'll spend, 5 to 10 minutes on that stuff, I would reckon. And then I'd also like to take a little bit of time on today's pod to revisit one of my favorite, and by favorite, of course, I'm being somewhat facetious, my favorite topics, and that is buying the hype. You'll see what I mean shortly. Let's talk about the Melo stuff, because there's two halves to this. There was obviously the portion that went down late last week, which, as you already know, frequent listeners of this podcast, we've already covered. Neil and Adrian went over it, but I do want to weigh in myself, and that is the Melo traded from the Thunder to the Hawks for Dennis Schroeder. Mike Muscala ends up moving up along the coast, I suppose you could say, to the Philadelphia 76ers, who had recently lost Nemanja Bjelica to Europe, and then Europe lost him to the Kings. Different story altogether, one that I'm not all that concerned with. And I'm not going to pay attention to the Mike Muscala part of this story as well. Dennis Schroeder was a wildly overvalued point guard. He is every season. I keep saying it on the podcast. Not interested, and now he's buried behind Russell Westbrook. I know they said sixth man on that team, but it's real hard to find value on the Thunder if your stat set in any way parallels what Westbrook does on a basketball court. The reason that Paul George can find success is because he's just banging away at three-pointers and getting steals. The reason that Steven Adams can have success in Oklahoma City is because he's getting offensive rebounds, he's getting steals, he's blocking shots, he has a very high field goal percentage. The reason that no one else can get anything is because basically that covers all of it. I mean, Melo was terrible. Robertson is not a fantasy factor. It doesn't matter where you look. And so with a guy like, Melo now gone, Dennis Schroeder jumps in, and maybe you could say he gets some shots, but Schroeder was already an overvalued fantasy asset before this trade. I saw, was it ESPN? I think it was ESPN. I was watching SportsCenter late one night over what's been an exhausting couple of weeks here, and they flashed a stat that only 6 guys in the NBA or something like that averaged 17 points and 7 assists last year, and they showed LeBron and Westbrook and Damian Lillard and someone else and Dennis Schroeder. And I looked at that list and thought, that is an unbelievably impressive job by ESPN of tailoring the stats to exactly what you needed. Like Schroeder has the impact on a team even close to what those other guys did. Okay, fine. I would say he made the Hawks better last year because overall the Hawks were pretty awful, and he was one of the few guys on their team that could actually go get a bucket. But from a fantasy standpoint, he's a disaster. He doesn't shoot the three-pointer. There's no floor spacing there. He doesn't get nearly as many steals as you might expect from someone of his speed and length. His shooting percentage is decent, but I don't think quite as good as people want to give him credit for. Like, it's all right for a point guard, above average. Overvalued every year. Every year someone's like, yeah, I'm going to take him in the 60s. And then every year, at least in 9-cat format, and 8-cat, he's obviously a little bit better. But 9-cat, he's pressing himself to get inside the top 100. Now you put him in behind Westbrook from a team where he was the only option. Yeah, no thanks. Carmelo Anthony going the other direction, and we knew immediately they were going to buy him out in Atlanta, so that's sort of a non-factor. And now we'll end up in Houston, but we'll get to that momentarily. So forget the Carmelo Anthony. We've talked the Thunder into absolute oblivion at this point. What about the Hawks? Well, things were looking interesting. Things were looking very interesting. And then they signed Alex Len in I don't want to say sort of, in a very weird twist. And unless I'm forgetting something else that happened here, and I don't think I am, the Hawks are just trying to jam themselves up. Like, okay, I've spent a few minutes on this, not an extended amount of time, but I'm pretty sure they still have Dwayne Dedmon for another year. By all accounts, he signed a 2-year deal last offseason. I think they still have a Plumlee unless they cut him loose. They have John Collins, who's this young, up-and-coming, very interesting basketball player. And now they added Alex Len? The removal of Dennis Schroeder was a really interesting turn of events for this team because it eliminated the guy that was orchestrating most of the offense. The guy that was, I don't want to say shouldering the load because, frankly, what load was it for the Atlanta Hawks? But Schroeder was taking 17 shots a game. That's a ton. That is a ton of bread getting thrown back into the basket. Someone's going to have to take those shots, and I think by all accounts, the initial thought was, well, John Collins is going to get a good chunk of that. Taurean Prince should see a chunk of that. Kent Bazemore's still on the Hawks right now, so he'll probably see a small chunk of it. And there was reason for rejoicing. Bringing in Alex Len almost forces the Hawks to play John Collins at power forward, which in the modern NBA is kind of an odd move for a guy who doesn't have a true outside shot. The value for John Collins was largely tied to field goal percentage. He took 7.5 shots a game last year and shot 58% from the field. If that's a number that holds in the mid-50s and his shot attempts go up to, 10 or 11, field goal percent becomes a massive positive. But if you're jamming him up in the middle, if you've got Dedmon or Len on the floor for some chunk of time, maybe most of the game, good heavens, and pushing Collins away from the basket, that hurts him in one of the fields where we're all hoping for him to excel. Don't get me wrong, I still like John Collins, but the way that this whole thing has shaken itself out is strange and upsetting. Let's look at the Atlanta Hawks now as a whole and see really what kind of picture we've built for this team. Trae Young, by the way, figures to get a lot of those Dennis Schroeder shots as well. And they also have Jeremy Lin on the roster. Remember, he's there too now. They made a deal with the Nets. So they've got all sorts of bodies floating around on this team. Bazemore, Lin, Dedmon, Young, Taurean Prince, Collins. How does it all fit together? Who's been a beneficiary in all of this stuff? I happen to think that we see, and health obviously being a very large factor, I think we happen to see some, and useful, by the way, Jeremy Lin. We've all forgotten, I think, what a stat magnet that dude can be when someone turns him loose a little bit. Yes, it's been quite some time since Linsanity in New York. But if he's out on the floor and he has any kind of autonomy, which one would assume he will when he's out there, because he's basically the veteran on the Hawks, I guess with Dwayne Dedmon, Jeremy Lin can put up stats in a hurry. He's not going to blow you away with field goal percent. No way. He's not a bad free throw shooter. He's an 80%er on his career. He'll usually knock down some three-pointers. He'll usually get you some steals. Actually, not bad in that perspective. Well over 1 steal per 36. And he actually blocks a couple of shots from the point guard spot. I'm a little bit, I'm curious how the Hawks plan to divvy things up. I think a lot of people are just going to assume that Trae Young is going to be out there just firing away. I don't think that's entirely true. I think there is a purpose here to Jeremy Lin, to be that one voice on this team that's actually been around the block a little bit. And by the way, Jeremy Lin isn't even 30 years old yet, so he's not like a crusty old codger on this team, but he is the veteran. And you really need a guard that's not going to just throw it away. I mean, Trae Young, he had his struggles at times even during Summer League. That's a guy, when you throw him into a real, full NBA-style game, you could see 4 or 5 turnovers a night. And Lin, by the way, by himself, pretty high turnover guy, and he's going to be the one they rely on to cool things down, keep it settled, orchestrate, make sure the other bodies are involved. I think he's going to actually see some time if he can stay on the floor, because, he's played 37 games the last 2 years combined. After, by the way, being moderately durable for the previous 4 seasons in his bench roles. In, 26, 27, 28 kind of minute numbers. So I actually kind of like Jeremy Lin, which I know sounds like bona fide madness, but I think he's going to be a bit undervalued this year because of 2 really rough seasons, and I think you could get him really late. And that way, if he gets hurt and you have to cut him loose, no harm done. Kent Bazemore is going to be out on the floor for decent stretches of time. They're going to need him to keep things kind of under control. You're going to see a lot of Taurean Prince. I think you're going to see Taurean Prince as a 3 and a stretch 4 this year. And you're going to see a decent amount of John Collins. That's why I hate this Alex Len signing. Because they're going to want to use Dwayne Dedmon as, again, a vocal veteran. Get him on the court. I don't know what the hell they're planning on doing with Len, who, to Atlanta's credit, maybe they'd figure, hey, we got this giant dude that Phoenix totally butchered for the last couple of seasons. Maybe we can turn him into something. But I don't like what it does to available minutes. And for that reason, I'm a little bit lower on some of the Hawks' bigs than the rest of the fantasy community. And you know what? I would actually be thrilled if I was wrong on this one. It's weird for me to say that. I don't want to be right, but I do think that there's a reason for some caution with a guy like John Collins. And I want to stress this again. This is like, I feel like I'm looking down the Giannis Antetokounmpo path all over again, where people are going to be like, oh, Dan Besbris hates John Collins. He hates him. No. I cannot stress this enough. I like John Collins. I think he's going to be an interesting fantasy basketball player this year. But he strikes me as one of those names we're hearing already in July. Things haven't even picked up yet, but I've seen tweets fly past my screen repeatedly where he is ranked inside the top 50, and maybe he gets to that point. But if that's where he's getting drafted, we've blown out the value. And so for that reason, I think I'm going to end up with very few shares of John Collins, who, by the way, had himself a brilliant short summer league deal and looks every bit as good as we all sort of thought he was becoming. But there's just a weird thing going on in Atlanta right now. What are they doing? The reason that we can give him those elevated numbers, or the reason the fantasy community can, is because we don't really know what he can become yet. We saw flashes, good field goal percent, decent rebounding numbers, got himself some blocks. That number actually improved a bit over the course of the year. Got himself some steals, although that's a number that, with big guys, we often see actually diminish a little over time. Do those translate? Is this going to be like a Miles Turner thing where more opportunity actually doesn't work in his favor? The issues of fighting with other big men to get nearer to the basket, how is that going to play itself out? Will he add a three-point shot? Will his free throw percentage improve? There are all these things that could either topple or catapult, so there is some wiggle room there. But I am betting that based on all of the very high preseason rankings I'm seeing from other fantasy analysts, and smart ones, by the way, sharp cats, that it's going to ruin his value. I feel like by the time your fantasy draft happens, and maybe your league is drafting in like 2 weeks, and maybe you can still get John Collins in the 70s or 80s or something like that, but I got a feeling that he's going to be like this year's Aaron Gordon, where he comes out, Yahoo pre-ranking him at like 95, and then he's going in the 40s by the end of September. And that's fine if you absolutely positively must have him on your team, but there are a lot of things that can go wrong in terms of a guy meeting his potential. And I don't know if he's going to clear that range. It's really hard. We've talked about this on the podcast before. It's not that hard to get inside the top 75. It's doable to get inside the top 50. It's really hard to get inside the top 40. Only the best get inside the top 25, and then, you get inside that top 15, and you're talking about some serious contenders. So for John Collins, yeah, I do see a world where he could crack the top 50. He was number 92 in 9-cat this year. He's a low turnover guy, and he'll probably always have a little bit of an edge in 9-cat format. If you extrapolate his numbers, if he plays 28, 29 minutes this year instead of 24, you're talking about a guy that could average 15 and 10 with 1.5 blocks, and that's pretty good. That gets you awfully close to top 50. If he adds the three-pointer and the field goal percent holds, yeah, you're talking about a top 50 guy. But what if there's a logjam? What if the minutes don't translate? What if field goal percent comes down? What if he ends up taking a lot of free throws at 71%? There are a lot of reasons why it's really hard for dudes to make that extra leap. And so for Collins, I do think in 9-cat format, I think he should be able to cruise inside the top 75. I think there's a very real possibility he ends up inside the top 65. And there is an outside chance he finishes in the top 50. But is that really where you want to draft a guy? Because then you've eliminated the value. And we could insert almost anybody's name in his place so that you guys don't think that I'm clowning on John Collins. Because like I said, I really like him. And I wouldn't mind if he ended up on my fantasy team. Just call whoever we're talking about here Player X. And if the best possible season for Player X is number 45, or hell, let's just even say number 40, that's the best thing that could ever happen over the next 12 calendar months. And he's getting drafted at 45, 46, meaning you'd have to take him there. That's a pretty narrow window where you could actually win out on that pick. That's all I'm trying to say here. Player Y is going to have to put together a perfect season, I think, for where his draft position will end up for that to make sense. Meanwhile, I do think other guys on this team might end up going underdrafted. I don't think Taurean Prince is one of those dudes. I think people are well aware of what he did, putting up those colossal numbers the last month and a half last year. Guy like Kent Bazemore, who finished inside the top 85 last year, just sort of quietly plugging along with big defensive numbers. Some threes, some points, some rebounds, some assists. The field goal percent was really the thing that knocked him off, and I don't think that's going to improve much. But again, all of these guys you see as an opportunity to kind of reel in Trae Young and no more Dennis Schroeder. So there's going to be some chances out there. Going through just the big names very quickly here on this Hawks team, I think Kent Bazemore is going to be a nice, easy grab, although they're going to try to move him. They might even move him before the season starts, but they'll certainly try to do it mid-year. So don't spend anything higher than about a top 120 pick on Baze, and try to go later if you can. John Collins, I don't think we're going to end up with because I think he's going to be overvalued. But if he slips into the 60s and 70s, then I would consider it. Taurean Prince, man, I really have no idea where he's going to get drafted next season. But he should be pretty good. Top 50 kind of numbers late last year, although, again, he was running a lot of the offense at that point. I think if Taurean Prince gets into the, let's say 70, I would probably look at him, but he's probably going to go earlier than that. There is some downside with him. There is. And Jeremy Lin, who I think actually has some value this year, because I mean, there might be leagues where he doesn't get drafted, and he's a guy that can leap. He just fire himself into the top 75 pretty fast because of the steals, because of the threes, because of the assists. It covers up for his bad field goal percent number, but he can move pretty quick. He has a fantasy stat set that can move him fast. And finally, now the last point that I want to make, and by the way, that was our little segue into don't buying the hype. Not because the hype is wrong, but because the hype is big. Once somebody's hyped, that's like buying a stock after it's already gone up. You want to get it when it's low. You want to get it on the John Collins train before everybody knew about it. I think everybody basically knows about it now. Now, Melo. Oh, Melo. Carmelo Anthony finished at the number 120 slot last year in 9 category formats on 16 points, 6 boards, 2.2 3-pointers, a miserable 40.4% shooting on 15 shots a game. He also had one of his worst free throw shooting years with the Thunder. He didn't turn the ball over at all, but a basically unforgivable season for Carmelo Anthony. He now will likely go to Houston, and we're going to operate here for a moment under the assumption that he will, and under the assumption that he's going to play. Because Houston lost Trevor Ariza. They lost Luke Baumute. They don't really want to play Ryan Anderson, which leaves them with basically P.J. Tucker to take care, and I like P.J. Tucker, by the way, but one guy, basically at this point, to take care of the 3 and the 4. And you can throw some other names out there if you want. But I'm just being pragmatic about the whole thing. The Rockets have minutes available at the 3 and the 4. And a pretty good number of them. So there are going to be stretches where you've got Chris Paul, Eric Gordon, and James Harden on the floor. That'll take care of the 3. When Eric Gordon's not out there, Harden's really more of a 2. And then you're done. They don't have options. Ryan Anderson is hurt all the time. Can't defend anybody. Although neither can Melo, really. P.J. Tucker is outstanding, but he's only one man. He can't play 2 positions on the court. Clint Capella, by the way, we're going to assume that he gets re-signed in all of this stuff. I mean, there were stretches in the playoffs last year where they played P.J. Tucker at the 5. So they're willing to try some pretty obscene things in Houston. And it makes me think, this is a guy who has been crushed, positively crushed by the media, by the public, by the teams he's played for. And there's a weird little window now. Let's look at quickly here. And I don't want to spend too much time on it because a lot of things can still change between now and opening day. But let's quickly look at Melo's career numbers. And I'm not talking about when he was really young with Denver or even during his early stints with the Knicks. I'm talking about lately. Last season with the Thunder, far and away his worst season as a pro. And you say, well, was it because he moved farther away from the basket? Nope. I mean, maybe, if you want to say average shot was farther away from the hoop. But he took 6.1 3-pointers per game last year. He took 6.2 5 years ago and shot 45% from the field that year. He's averaged close to 6 3-pointers a game on multiple occasions. And he's always been about a 35%er from three-point land, so that didn't get any worse last season. Where he was terrible was actually from two-point land. Why might that be? Well, because he just didn't fit. He tried to be a spot-up guy. He did, actually. He changed his game for Oklahoma City last season. Maybe not enough as what people might have wanted, but he just didn't get good looks. One thing you can say for damn sure, in Houston, he'll be open. He was not open in Oklahoma City. In fact, I'm pretty sure I saw a metric a few weeks ago that talked about the fact that Melo was actually taking some of the most guarded shots in the league, despite playing with Paul George and Russell Westbrook. And that's an indictment of the Thunder's offense, which we've talked about plenty of times on this podcast. It's pretty awful. So now you move him from one of the worst offensive scheme teams in the NBA, with a ball-dominant Russell Westbrook, to a team with two ball-dominant players who are also one of the best two passers in the NBA, in Harden and Chris Paul. And a coach who's pretty good at getting people open looks. You know, if Ariza is getting open looks, if PJ Tucker's getting open looks, I think Melo will find a few. Luke Ba-Mute is getting open looks. Some things for Melo will never change. He's never going to be a big steals or blocks guy, but those were worse this year also. Some of that, I think, was just diminished playing time. But you can bet that there is going to be some opportunity in Houston. Will he average 16 points per game? Actually, maybe. Because I don't think it's going to take him 15 shots to get there. I think you're looking at a guy who might take fewer shots than last year and average more points. He's always been a really good free throw shooter. This year was the aberration. In fact, it was his worst season. Yeah, in a 15-year NBA career, worst free throw shooting season of all time. It was his worst two-point shooting season in his NBA career. Also, fewest number of two-pointers taken in his NBA career. So what do we expect from Melo going forward? It's not going to be all-star Melo, so let's not get ahead of ourselves. But he was pretty durable this year. He only missed 4 games for the Thunder. High percentage of his shots are coming from the perimeter right now. So yes, you could argue he didn't take that many two-pointers this year, but he also shot worse on them than ever before. I think that's a number you see come up. The percentage on two-pointers for Melo. I think you see the number of three-pointers stay consistent for Carmelo Anthony. But he's a decent rebounder. He always has been okay on the glass. He's a guy that gets his own rebound pretty often. He's not a terrible passer. He just didn't have any opportunity to do so this year. You know, he got fed the ball. That was the Westbrook offense, man. One pass and go. And while he did finish outside the top 100, and that's hardly reason for optimism to say, well, I could easily see Carmelo do just as well as last year, I think that we see a slight improvement from him. He's going to be in a better place, better players around him, or smarter players around him. How about that? A team that'll utilize him better. And so if you can get Melo, 9 or 8 cat, I don't care what you're talking about here. If you can get him outside the top 100, I think it's worth a shot. His fantasy stat set doesn't really have a ton of room to leap him back inside the top 40 or 50 because there really isn't anything on the defensive side, and he's okay at free throws, but three of the 4 things in my estimation that can move a guy quickly for Melo are not very good. So he's not one of the guys that I'm usually targeting, but I also do tend to like guys who are wildly undervalued, and I think that's the case with Carmelo Anthony right now. Somehow a guy who's averaged 24 points for his NBA career is crazy undervalued. And I think he's still got something in the tank. I see him as a winner in all of this. I see Jeremy Lin as a winner in all of this stuff. Temporarily, at least. I think Kent Bazemore is probably a winner. Losers in all of this, Dennis Schroeder, obviously. John Collins slightly, with the Alex Len stuff going on. And then there are guys that probably hover around that same point. Taurean Prince, I don't know that it impacts him a whole lot. Trae Young, so on and so forth. All right, Adrian Benjamins will join me on tomorrow's podcast. We'll get back into some of that foundational stuff. That's fun. I like those discussions. And we'll carry that theme throughout the next few weeks. I'm Dan Besbris. This is Fantasy NBA Today. Have a wonderful Monday, everybody. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
This has been a Hoop Ball presentation.